Skagway, a major port in '98, is still abuzz with activity. Here the stampeders, scalawags, and scoundrels landed on their way to the gold fields. And here, the first rails of the White Pass were spiked down. Is it any wonder that tens of thousands of Americans are still drawn to this Mecca? And at the center, the White Pass Depot, a haven for those enchanted by this living link with another time.
The White Pass is one of the last operating narrow-gauge railroads in North America. It is certainly the very last railroad which carried freight, and because of that, you might say it was the last of an entire breed, an era. And it is doing more or less today what it did back in 1898 as a passenger railroad. It's still hauling people from Tidewater at Skagway, Alaska, up over the Coast Mountain Range to the headwaters of the Yukon River.
Daily trains leave the Skagway station led by WP&YR's restored 1947 Baldwin steam engine, number 73. At the edge of town, the regular diesel locomotives take over for the trip to the summit and beyond.
The 73 is the last of the White Pass steam engines, and we don't have a cornucopia of spare parts to keep the old puppy running. The company is continually scouring the world trying to find material to keep the locomotive up and operational. So the engine doesn't operate up the hill more or less to save it. The crews loved the 70 class engines. There were only 4 of them constructed. The first in 1938, and the 73, of course, is the last of that fleet of 4 engines, the most modern of the bunch. Probably the most impressive thing about the railroad is the scenic grandeur that you see from the line. It hangs precariously on the side of a 1,000-foot cliffs. It's got spiderweb wooden trestles and old snow sheds and slide galleries and cascading waterfalls going down into Dead Horse Gulch down below the tracks. The scenery, the scenic railway of the world. I suppose the thing that I personally like about the White Pass is the fact that it's been operating all the way back to the gold rush. This is a direct link with the Klondike Stampede of 1898. I mean, these parlor cars, many of them date back to the 1880s and the 1890s. The right-of-way itself was blasted out of the side of the cliff during the Klondike Gold Rush. This is an actual operating link back 89, 90 years, and because of that, you've got something here that's very, very special. There are very few companies that can claim heritage all the way back to the Stampede to the Klondike.
It began in 1896, when 3 wandering prospectors discovered gold in the Klondike Valley. By July the following year, the fever was rampant. In Seattle, a ton of gold was dumped on the docks, and the rush was on. Black-suited and bowler-hatted, many traveled via the Lynn Canal to the Alaskan port of Skagway. From here, they struck out for the border, some through the White Pass with its infamous Dead Horse Gulch. No matter which way they came, the Northwest Mounted Police saw to it that each man entered Canada with the prescribed 1 ton of supplies, a process that would require many to make up to 40 trips up and down the pass. For those who overcame the first ordeal and were permitted into the Yukon, 500 miles still separated them from the Klondike goldfields. It was evident from the start that a properly organized transportation system was required. Early in 1898, the problem was solved by the chance meeting in Skagway of Sir Thomas Tancred, representing the English financial house of Close Brothers, and a young Canadian railway engineer, Michael J Heney.
Tancred arrived in March 1898 with his engineering partners into Skagway, Alaska. They went up the White Pass Trail by horse. They saw the carnage left behind by the winter on the Dead Horse Trail, and Tancred was appalled at the country. The winter bleakness in the White Pass must have just set him off, because upon returning back down the trail to the St. James Hotel, he had determined and told his engineering partners that he was going to write a letter to London informing them that the project was impossible. The grades would be too steep, the winter could not be dealt with in terms of the drift, the snow, the avalanches. By quirk of fate, as the group retired to the bar to warm up after their trip on the trail, another fellow came in to the hotel, also dirty and haggard after days, obviously, in the saddle. A young gentleman named Michael J Heney.
And he was a Canadian, young railroad builder, made his name in building the Canadian Pacific Railway as a young contractor. And he had gone up there as an independent surveyor all by himself, financed himself, to see if a railroad could be built. And he was convinced a railroad could be built. So he came down to the St. James Hotel one night, walked in, and met these 3 fellows who were just deciding to tell Close Brothers that they were not going to build a railroad. And he convinced them that they should build a railroad and that he was the guy to build it. And that's the way it turned out. And that was the start of it. And they hired him on as the labor contractor. And later he became the contractor of record and in fact built the railroad.
Heney immediately began assembling together all of the tools and the manpower required to build a 110-mile railway in the middle of totally unsurveyed, untouched wilderness. They weren't even exactly sure that Heney's rough survey was where they were going to put the track.
Construction began on May 27, 1898. Within 2 months, Mike Heney had the first passenger train running 4 miles towards the summit. His exacting standards saw costs soar to $120,000 a mile, an astronomical figure for a narrow-gauge railway.
Here you had these great shoulders of granite coming down from each side of a valley, and they interlocked like the giant teeth of a gear. And the railroad had to move in and around these giant shoulders. Now, there was one place called Rocky Point where engineers of great repute simply said it's impossible to get a railroad around there. And Michael J Heney did it. He did it again and again and again, where it was regarded as a place that no railroad should be.
By July 29, 1900, the ordeal was over. The last spike was driven at Carcross.
The White Pass in Yukon arrived in Whitehorse with the driving of the spike on June the 8th, 1900. When the rail was spiked down, the White Pass trains could connect to stern-wheel steamboats on the Yukon River, which would then continue on down 400 miles to Dawson City. The steamboats that the White Pass operated were early on the river with dozens of other companies' ships, but the buccaneering spirit of the time, driving freight rates so far down, made it impossible for anyone to make any money. The White Pass, therefore, went into the business in a big way. They actually bought out all of the steamers on the river and formed British Yukon Navigation Company, of which the Klondike, SS Klondike, was a flagship of that fleet. The Klondike excitement, the stampede, had lasted from July of '97, when word hit the outside world, through that incredible winter of '97-'98 that gave us the images of men and women climbing up the 45-degree angles of the Golden Stair at the summit of Chilkoot Pass. Those images were completely ended with the completion of the railway. The last grand adventure that the Klondike was, of man against the elements with his horses or his pack on his back, that was ended by the creation of the Grand Victorian Age of the most modern transport system on the planet. The rail, the steam engine connecting to steam vessels, steam riverboats. And the completion of the railway, the Golden Spike, the ceremony at Carcross in July of 1900, ending that period of northern history, changed everything. And modern technology of the 20th century was now available to transport man and material from the tidewater at Skagway over the Coast Range and down to the gold fields at Dawson City. A trip which had taken 6 months now took only 6 days.
3 months after the line was completed, it shivered beneath the first snowfall. The challenge of the White Pass winter, complete with its annual 30 to 40 feet of snow, was at hand. For the next 60 winters, the canyons and mountains echoed with the rumble of 2 giant snowblowers. The rotary plow, pushed by 2 steam locomotives, could slice its way through drifts up to 12 feet deep. Without the rotary crews, nothing moved. They were considered the elite of the railway. In the early 60s, Larry Sullivan was part of such a crew, one that suffered the worst blizzard conditions in living memory.
It was in 1962, I forget what month it is. It was in the winter time. But that particular trip, we left Skagway and we had the 70 and the 71 for the 2 pushers and rotary number 2, I believe. Oh, geez, it was blown like crazy up there and cold, north wind. And we got up just this side of 23 mile per hour. And the rotary stopped, a blue whistle that we stopped, and they're running out of water.
At a standstill, 23 miles from Skagway, their troubles had just begun. The basic problem for the rotaries had always been to keep a clear path behind them so they could return for fuel and water. There were other concerns, too.
There was about a 10-foot drift they went into, and the snow came in through the caboose, and the conductor and the brakeman was up in the cupola, and it filled the caboose, and we got stopped, and we sat there for 4 days.
By the end of the week, another rotary fleet, 50 men, 4 bulldozers, a dog sled team, and the Alaska State Airline had been called into play. At its conclusion, an appreciative White Pass general manager stated, "I can't pay enough tribute to the courage, plain guts, and endurance of the men." 25 years later, snow removal is still a big job. At the beginning of the summer season, bulldozers are let loose in the White Pass snow. Working as a team, they're more efficient than the rotaries. As for their lack of romance, few White Pass veterans would return to the good old days. In 1942, the U.S. government leased the line for the construction of the Alaska Highway. With 15,000 tons of freight to be moved every 2 weeks, more than the railway had handled in the previous 12 months, the company was clearly out of its depth. In October, the 770th Railway Operating Battalion moved in. Close behind were 26 additional locomotives, 258 cars, and all the expertise to do the job.
For many, many years, Alaska had been trying to convince Congress in Washington that there should be a land link between the lower 48 states and Alaska. Quite reasonable. Well, after Pearl Harbor, there was no problem because Dutch Harbor had been bombed, the Japanese were on the move. How was Alaska going to be defended? Was it possible that a great mass of men were going to land in Alaska and make their way down through northern Canada and into the United States? It was a pincher movement. Almost overnight, the United States Army, with the approval and orders of President Roosevelt, said, build a tote road and get it moving so that we can get men and equipment and material up into Alaska to defend it. Well, when one of the key places was at Skagway, Alaska. So the White Pass and Yukon Railway, for the second time in its life, found itself in the midst of a great human drama. First being the Klondike Gold Rush, the second being World War II.
110 miles away in Whitehorse, a heavily populated military camp soon sprang up. With up to 17 trains a day running around the clock, bottlenecks quickly developed. Staff Sergeant Marvin Taylor was sent to Whitehorse.
One morning, 8 o'clock, when we fell out, they said, Taylor, take your platoon to Whitehorse, unload those rail cars and get them back, and we'll bring you back in about 30 days. A lot of the contractors had their own little sidings in, and we would, everything was priority. And whichever contractors offered us 2 meals for that day, lunch and dinner, that's where we worked. It was a very exciting winter. The Army battalion that operated the railroad, of course, was all railroaders basically, but it never operated under those conditions or that light of equipment. And in the beginning, they just simply refused to accept advice from the older head that had been here and operated that railroad. And I remember one time, it was 21 days that they were stalled out there. But they go out there and try to buck those winter storms where they've been better off to have laid back for a day and then attacked it. But no, we know how to do this. And they sure as hell didn't.
The war over, the WP and YR emerged with its fabric in tatters and facing new competition. The highway that the White Pass helped to build now offered an alternative route to the Yukon. On a brighter note, tourism was re-emerging as a major player.
This is a remarkable railroad because basically you had British financing, American engineering, Canadian contracting. And the British people still, the board of directors was still in London, England. They still ran this railroad from London. And it wasn't until 1950 that they finally came around to realizing that in order for the railroad to play its part in the modern North, modern Canada, modern Alaska, that the railroad had to be revitalized and had to be run from Vancouver at least, or Whitehorse, where the a personal touch could be put onto the railroad to conduct its fares on a local basis.
By this time, mining and exploration were on the upswing. So too was a growing awareness of transportation costs to the territory. After careful analysis of the problem, White Pass prescribed the solution: the development of a fully integrated container system. It proved to be the world's first. With one bold stroke, White Pass had made transportation history again. A brand new ship, the Clifford J. Rogers, was commissioned. Built solely for the Yukon's ocean commerce, she could carry 200 5-ton containers. On arrival in Skagway, they were transferred to the railway. Reduced handling costs and an overall increase in shipping efficiency became the White Pass hallmark. To complete the system, new diesel-electric locomotives were purchased. The days of steam were over for now. Meanwhile, White Pass was well and truly in the 20th century. A decade later, Yukon's largest mine, Cypress Anvil, signed a contract with the railway to carry up to 370,000 tons of lead zinc ore a year. A record unbroken.
In point of fact, the whole White Pass system was upgraded to accommodate the Cypress Anvil mine, which was going to be shipping out hundreds of thousands of tons of product every year, lead and zinc. And this meant new locomotives, new flat cars, another ship. Clifford J. Rogers was retired. Frank H. Brown was brought on, the most modern container ship in the world. It was joined later by a sister ship called the Klondike. And trucks were brought in, bridges were built, tunnels were blasted. A huge amount of money was spent in upgrading the railroad to accommodate Cypress Anvil Mine, which operated for many, many years up until 1973, 74, when there began to be some worry as to whether or not it was going to run. But it did. It kept on running up until about 1981, I believe the time was. And in 1981, the Cypress Anvil Mine, for reasons of its own, closed down. This eliminated the basic tonnage for which the railroad had been upgraded to carry. And no longer could it afford to maintain these facilities without the income of Cypress Anvil Mine. So under those circumstances, it was forced to close down. There's another factor, too, that enters into this, and that is the people of Skagway and the Alaskan government and the Yukon government, the federal government of Ottawa, decided that it might be a great idea to build a highway right alongside the railroad. And there's no question that any time you have a railroad operating, which relies on freight to earn its income, has to compete with trucks, it has a real problem on its hands. And having lost the mines, freight, and being faced with the competition of trucking, it was no longer economical to run the railroad. So the first time in over 80 years, the White Pass and Yukon Railway ceased to operate. However, it lay dormant for a while And there were various rumors that it was going to start up again. The mine was going to start up again. This was happening, that was happening. But there was never any real justification. But then Skagway had, in the meantime, had become a really very important destination for travelers, tourists. Always had been. But there was many cruise ships coming up, loaded with passengers, eager to absorb the history of the Trail of 98.
Will everybody get another couple pictures of their ship in the harbor, maybe themselves with the city in the background?
And almost by popular request, people said, we hear about this wonderful White Pass Railway, which incidentally goes through some of the most magnificent and awe-inspiring scenery in the world. That bit of railroad between Skagway and the White Pass summit, I think, is the most magnificent 20 miles of railroad anywhere in the world. No question about it. Sawtooth Mountains and the great glaciers. No wonder people said, bring it back. So the White Pass and Yukon route, listen to this.
Tourism going through the port of Skagway, Alaska, had doubled between the closure of the railway and 1988. The White Pass Company made a gamble to attempt to operate a seasonal, summertime-only passenger excursion train operation. And it was a success. In 1988, we hauled 36,000 passengers on the train. And now what's happening is that instead of people asking about the little narrow gauge train that they hear might be running, people are calling us up on the phone saying, when does the train leave? The 110 miles from Skagway, Alaska to Lake Bennett, British Columbia and on to Whitehorse in the Yukon were the original main line. We have actually 40 miles of track in some form of passenger service. We have to walk before we can run, and in that respect it has been a major accomplishment for us to extend the service into Canada and to become the last Canadian narrow gauge railway operating passenger service. And of course then the 12 miles onto Lake Bennett is a major piece of track to operate also.
Lake Bennett, the head of navigation for the Yukon River and the primary staging point for the Gold Rush stampeders. Climbing the Chilkoot, the stampeders spent the winter of '97 here. Their destination was still 550 miles away. Their route, once the ice melted, was down the Yukon River. Here, hundreds of boats were built. The Mounties logged over 7,000 passing by their post at Tagish. And when they were not building boats, they built this church. When the ice melted, the boats were launched, and the stampeders were gone. And so, too, was the congregation.
The biggest problem we've had is that Mondays and Tuesdays, because of the stack-up of ships in Skagway, the large cruise lines that come into town, were extremely hectic equipment demand-wise on us. We had to run every single piece of passenger equipment we could muster. All 34 operating pieces of equipment had to be out running on the railroad on Mondays and Tuesdays for the sales opportunities. So we would always get out and listen to the weather report the night before, because one of the cars that we had, the roof leaked on one end of it there fairly badly, and we hadn't had time to put the new roof on. So we were always out there at night waiting, praying to the dear Lord that it wouldn't rain.